But to recap where we are today, we are in the last of Jesus' instructions to his 12 disciples who are now becoming apostles as they're being sent out by Jesus. Jesus first modeled for them the quality rather than quantity style of ministry. It's a style of ministry where Jesus goes at 3 miles an hour in steady, personal, respectful evangelism with the new thing that he's carrying. This is the spiritual kingdom of heaven. Another way to consider it as we're moving up to presidential elections and everything, it's not just the kingdom of heaven, it's the politics of heaven. If you want to see how heaven works and how things happen and how things are governed and where everybody fits in, this is the politics of heaven. Kingdom is an ancient way to say the same thing, and it has a gospel. It has the good news of life. We read all the way back at the beginning of Matthew's gospel that the world is caught under the shadow of death. It's in darkness. And so Jesus is bringing the light. And he's bringing this new thing, and he's set it off with instructions on how to carry it. These instructions make up Jesus' second of 5 major discourses. Remember, we looked at Matthew's remaking the Old Testament. And if Moses got 5 major parts in the Old, Jesus will get 5 major parts in the new one that Matthew's writing. He's remaking the First Testament, and he's putting Jesus on par with Moses. So he's going to give him the same number of major parts. So Jesus gets ready to send out his newly promoted apostles. He's sending them out in pairs. And as they're beginners, he makes their first mission easy for them. They get to go to their own people, to their immediate surroundings, but they're to go with minimum supplies for travel. They can't take anything to sustain themselves beyond simply what it takes to put one foot in front of the other. They don't get a bag for supplies. They don't get to carry money to buy food on the road. Jesus is creating disciples, apostles, who will be dependent on community to sustain themselves. And where they don't find welcoming community, they're to simply move on. The entire time that they go, they're to carry peace and live peace. They carry peace both in where they find community and where they find rejection. There's a whole new concept for a people who grew up on this idea of God striking people down with lightning, and in a little bit, a Samaritan town is going to reject Jesus, and Jesus' disciples are going to be like, do we call down fire on this town? Let's annihilate them? And Jesus says, carry peace. Carry peace with you when you go, and keep your peace when you're rejected. Jesus had told them that when you carry my new thing, you have to leave behind the old things. The things that you assume come along for the journey don't get to come along. We found in the instructions that Jesus says things might not always be safe for them. Jesus says you will be in situations where you are in physical danger. And in there we find Jesus' permission to leave situations that are dangerous to our well-being. Jesus says, when you find yourself in a dangerous situation, get up from it and move on. So often, I've seen memes about it even, where someone has a picture and they look like they're under the boot of oppression, and then it zooms out and they're the ones holding the boot against their head. And sometimes Jesus, I think, just says, I've given you permission to leave dangerous situations. You don't have to just stay there and say, persecution, persecution. Jesus cares for our well-being, and in his instructions to the disciples, he says, go where it's safe. Flee from physical harm. Take care of yourselves. Jesus speaks up of not fearing the one who will slander you, This is the Jewish people. He also says not to fear the one who can kill just our body. This is the Roman Empire. They're the ones who had the authority of the death penalty. Jesus says the one to fear is Satan, the one who can bring us to Gehenna. Many English translations of the Bible call this hell, but the problem is there's a few different words that our English Bibles just all pile into the one English word called hell. And it makes us look forward to an eternal future time, when for the Jewish readers of Matthew, they would have heard the word Gehenna and they would have thought back to a horrible time in their history. A time where they descended spiritually into such depravity they were killing their own kids. And so referencing Gehenna references it's a horrific place of child sacrifice in the First Testament. But then Scripture gives it a symbolic value through the prophets and going on. It's a symbolic place of spiritual depravity, of doing things we never imagined we would do. And so Jesus says that Satan is the one who will bring us to our Gehennas of life. Satan is the one who seeks to draw us into the places where we'll do things we could have never previously imagined we would do. And it is in those places he seeks to draw us so completely that he can destroy us in our entirety, spirit and body. But even though Jesus says that Satan is the one to fear, he then goes on to say, but don't be afraid anyway. He says, don't be afraid anyway because you have a Father in heaven who cares even for the cheapest bird, a half-penny sparrow. If he has that much love for a half-penny bird, how much more love does he have for the pinnacle of his creation, humanity? And so Jesus says that he is living out his Father's love. It's a love that removes fear. So he says, Satan's the one to fear, but don't be afraid anyway, because this is how great my Father loves you. And I am showing you that love in my life. But then Jesus says this curious thing that we looked at last week about denying those who deny him, and it doesn't make sense how many have taken it. Many consider that Jesus is telling us here how amazing God's love is for us. But then Jesus also makes a comment that God's love, though, is only as faithful as we can be. If our courage falters under pressure, if we slip up, if we deny Jesus, then before God, he's going to say, I deny them then. But we skipped forward to an early church creed that Paul references in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. And this early church creed, it uses the words of Jesus from Matthew that refers to denying us if we deny him. But when we read the creed, it clarifies for us that Jesus does not throw us under the bus if we deny him. The creed tells us that when we are unfaithful, Jesus remains faithful. And we look to the Greek to realize that the word translated deny, it really means contradict or reject. And the meaning of Jesus' words about denying us is that he lives out the Father's love that refuses to give up on us. And what it means is that when we reject Jesus, he rejects our rejection. Jesus contradicts our unfaithfulness with his faithfulness. Because the creed that Paul tells us finishes with, Jesus is faithful even when we are not. Because Jesus cannot contradict himself. Jesus has to be the Father's love. So when we read Jesus saying that he will deny those who deny him, Jesus is saying, if you deny me, I will deny your denial. I will refuse to give up on you. And this is why, even as Jesus faces his own murder, the ultimate denial, he prays to his Father for the forgiveness of those who are killing him. He refuses to accept their oppression. When Jesus is oppressed, he opposes the opposition. So then we come to the next piece of information that Jesus gives in this discord. He says that he has not come to bring peace to the earth, but to bring a sword. So we might ask, just what sword did Jesus bring? We're going to go through a list of passages, and I have these on a slide. The clearest picture of the sword that Jesus brings is found in the book of Revelation. First, we turn to Revelation 1:16, where John is describing seeing Jesus. Revelation 1:16 says, "In his right hand he held 7 stars." Normally, if you're going to carry a sword and you're going to wield it, it would be in your right hand in those days. Jesus does not hold a physical sword in his right hand. He holds the 7 stars. But from his mouth comes a sharp, 2-edged sword. We then move on to Jesus going to war in Revelation 19:15. And it says, as Jesus is preparing to go to war, from his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. We don't see Jesus as the Viking hero with a literal sword raised. We see him with a sword of his mouth. Jesus' sword is the word that he speaks. It's the message that he carries. This is why the book of Revelation goes on to say in Revelation 19:21, as the battle happens, and then it comes to an end. It says, the kings of the earth and the nations were killed by the sword of the rider on the horse. They were killed by the sword that comes from his mouth. But we then find in the description of the heavenly Jerusalem, of who will inhabit the heavenly Jerusalem, we find in Revelation 21:24. The nations. These are the ones that we just heard were struck down by Jesus' sword and killed. The nations will walk by the light of heavenly Jerusalem. The kings of the earth, these are the ones that were just dead at the battle 2 chapters ago. But the kings of the earth will bring their glory into the heavenly Jerusalem. The same ones that many read as dead 2 chapters ago are the ones who now come into the heavenly Jerusalem. Jesus doesn't come back to earth to say, I forgave him last time, but I'm going to slice and dice him this time. He doesn't say the Sermon on the Mount didn't work, so now we'll work by the sword. Yes, Jesus does come to bring peace, not to bring peace to the world, because he will not live in harmony with an earth that is in the shadow of death. But the weapon of Jesus' war is not more death. It is the gospel of life. And Jesus knows that as his message goes to war against darkness and death, and as all the bits of us die off as they are pierced by his sword, it will be a divisive message. So he warns his followers to expect animosity and divisions over the message, even among people who should otherwise be united. The second discourse of Jesus closes with Jesus speaking of rewards. And of particular interest, we can turn to Matthew chapter 10, verses 41 to 42, and we'll read it really quick. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever even gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Theologian Bruner, he points out that there are unconscious acts of charity that we're meant to do just randomly in our lives to people who are in need, just in general. Of these cases, Jesus says these unconscious or random acts of charity, the things you do to anyone, they're done to me. But in this passage, these are conscious, deliberate acts of charity. These are conscious and deliberate acts of charity that target the people who are in God's community. And Jesus says that God appreciates his people being taken care of by anybody. He says, if anybody identifies one of my people and they're in need, I love when you help them. All of God's community is in view in these three levels of people. You have the prophet. This is the one who speaks God's message. You have the righteous. These are the ones who live God's message. And the Greek word translated little one in the verse, it refers to someone who is pictured as the littlest status in the church. Someone who is at their most simple, just trying to be a disciple of Jesus. This would cover down to your most ordinary Christian who just comes to church and loves God's message. What Jesus is saying here, if we can put the slide back up of this passage. If you welcome a prophet because you identify that they're a prophet, if you welcome a righteous person because you identify they're a righteous person, if you welcome the person of lowest status because you simply see they're a disciple of mine, to those who identify my people, the ones who speak, live, and follow my message, and if you will care for them when they're in need, I will give you a special reward. This can be as simple as gathering on a Sunday morning and supporting each other as we already do. This isn't a big and extravagant thing, and it can be simply bringing refreshment to someone, whether it's a literal cup of water or simply a hug and an encouraging word. The Greek word for welcome in this passage can speak as deeply as sharing all your resources with someone. Or it can refer to something as little as tolerating someone. It can refer to tolerating someone and simply putting up with them being in the same room. So what we find in Jesus' words here is that God makes the request for charity to his people as cheap and easy as possible, with the starting place simply set at, will you sit in the same room with another one of my people? Sit with them just for a little bit of time, even if you don't like them. And we just tolerate them for a little bit. That's where welcome begins. And this is the foundational request for charity to God's people. It is one that can be afforded by all. On that note, we close Jesus' second discourse as we read in Matthew 11:1. Now when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, they transformed into apostles, and they went out. And Jesus too went from there to teach and proclaim his message to the Jewish cities. The newly promoted apostles go out 2 by 2, and they head off. And Jesus goes off to continue his work as well. And this section of Matthew closes. Hopefully you're seeing how Matthew has deliberately arranged his material into sections of a book. We have this on a slide. This is built on Bruner's division of Matthew, and this is Matthew's arrangement. We have the coming of Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, and it was in story form, Matthew 1 through 4. We have the Sermon on the Mount. These are the words of Jesus. So we've had the coming, and now these are the words of Jesus, or the message of Jesus. And this was in discourse format, Matthew 5 through 7. Then we have Jesus working the 10 miracles in the valley. And these are in story again. We've gone story to discourse to story. And what we've just wrapped up was the mission of Jesus. And it went back to the discourse style. And that was Matthew 10. So we've seen the coming of Jesus. We've heard the message of Jesus. We've seen the works of Jesus. And we've just talked about the mission of Jesus. Now in Matthew chapters 11 through 12, we're going to find out about who Jesus is as a person. We're going to go into the person of Jesus. And as Matthew's been alternating between story and discourse, we go back to story format. The format I prefer. Discourse gets a little, can get bogged down, but I love the story, and I love how Matthew tells the story. And so we're going to go into the story of Jesus, and as we move through Matthew chapter 12, we will have covered the Christ book portion of Matthew. Matthew chapters 1 through 12 are all about Jesus. That's the Christ book. And then we'll look at the next half of Matthew. But through chapter 12 is where we see Jesus revealed, and we begin to see who he is. And the final section of the Christ book begins in Matthew chapter 11 as we turn our attention back to John the Baptist. The last time we saw John, though, was in Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 13. It reads that now, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth, and he made his home in Capernaum, by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. John gets arrested, and this is really for many reasons, but he's a threat to the rulers. He's a threat to the power dynamic, and Jesus will give a speech about John in a second, where he's going to highlight how upright and morally strong of a person John the Baptist is. He will say, John is not one who blows with the wind. John's arrest causes Jesus to flee to Capernaum, where then we saw that he calls Matthew, and there's this house he operates out of that Matthew calls the house. So John's arrest moves Jesus to Capernaum. And now, as Matthew returns us to a story-based section, we begin by checking back in on John the Baptist. Place yourselves in his sandals today. This man was born to a great promise. He was to be the forerunner of the Messiah. Part of this meant that he was called to a hard, difficult lifestyle. He has sacrificed a lot for his calling. And think of the joy in his heart as he saw Jesus crest the hill several chapters ago. And John knew this was the promised Messiah. Here comes Emmanuel, God with us. There was joy in his heart because he saw the Messiah. At least John thought he saw the Messiah. He thought he knew this was the Messiah. But here he sits rotting in prison. And he's not seeing the deliverance that he thought was supposed to come with the Messiah. As he sits in prison, he's hearing reports that the one John thought was there to save them is running around the countryside with lepers, with blind men, with tax collectors, and with women. This is a far cry from gathering an army to march on Jerusalem and overthrow the oppressors and save God's people and save John. John is facing a crisis of faith, and he sends some disciples out for clarity to Jesus. This event is one that has been surrounded with controversy since many Christian leaders through the years, they don't want to suggest that Jesus' forerunner actually had doubts about who Jesus was. These leaders go back as far as Jerome, who was an ancient figure in the church. Even before him, Augustine, Luther, Calvin, major names in the church, have refused to believe that John the Baptist could doubt. These people could not tolerate a human forerunner to Jesus, one who struggles with his faith, because that messed with their idea of faith. A suggestion from this group has been that as John languishes in prison and he sees his time coming up, he sends his disciples to Jesus to go ask who Jesus is so they can see who Jesus is and then come to follow Jesus. I believe they're attempting to remove the humanity from the people in the Bible. In the early church especially, the majority opinion, they refused to consider that John was a doubter. Tertullian was almost by himself, an ancient figure. He was almost by himself in considering that, yes, John fell into doubt when things with Jesus didn't go as John expected. In more modern times, Matthew Henry, he wrote a commentary a long time ago, really, 18th century, 19th. He wrote a commentary that helped break this dehumanization of John just to be a robot of faith who couldn't have doubted. In his commentary, Henry wrote about John, where there is true faith, there is very often doubt. So we come to consider through the faith of Abraham into the faith of John the Baptist that doubt is okay to have alongside faith. Supporting the idea that John doubted is the wording that is in Matthew that really doesn't allow for John to send his disciples to ask a question for their own benefit. Matthew 11, verses 2 through 6 is where this happens, where John sends the disciples. And it says, when John heard in prison that the Messiah was doing things that didn't look like the expected Messiah, doing things that were not going to save John, he sent word by his disciples. And he said to him, are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those with a skin disease are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. Leave this slide up as we go through this. I want to remember this last verse. You can imagine, though, John's difficulty. He had to pave the way for the one who was to save Israel. But where is the salvation? Like we said, John is wasting away in prison. While Jesus is not saving Israel, he's walking through Hicksville. These are not the people that are going to save me. Jesus has surrounded himself by those of no account, while the religious elite and those in power still run things. And from what John can see, Jesus really seems to suck at this Savior thing. In a short time, John will be killed. And he can probably see it coming. And he needs to know, what the heck is going on here? Was my life a farce? Did I fail? Did I not recognize the right one? Liz and I traveled to Idaho this last week, and I got a chance to reread Paul Young's book, The Shack. We actually listened to the audiobook while we drove, and John is facing the same problem that Mac, the main character in the book, faces. Mac faces a problem that when he sees God more clearly, God is not who he thought he was. And in the book, God challenges Mac. Perhaps your understanding of God is wrong. Perhaps it's not me that's wrong. I'm God. Perhaps your understanding is wrong. What John is going through is what all of Jesus' followers will go through while he was on earth. It's a realization that their paradigm, the way they understood things, would have to change. And today we often call this deconstruction. This is where your faith or your theology hits up against a situation that it cannot compute. John is at a crossroads. Either Jesus isn't the Messiah, or Jesus is the Messiah, and John needs to deconstruct what he believed the Messiah was to be. And he now needs to reconstruct a new understanding. This is not the first time that John has faced deconstruction. When we first met John, he believed in a certain way that would not allow him to baptize Jesus. John refused Jesus' request for baptism. But Jesus challenges him and tells him that this must be done. So John changes his way of thinking as a little bit about God is revealed. He allows Jesus to abolish or deconstruct what he had thought, and he allows Jesus to reconstruct a new understanding. And here again, like in the baptism, things are not how John thought they should be. So he sends his disciples to Jesus to clarify matters. And Jesus gives John an amazing answer. The kids, you'll hear them coming back here in a second as we close with this answer. Jesus first tells John's disciples to go and tell John what they see and hear. Remember, in Matthew, we've just considered Jesus' message and his works, what are seen and heard. Jesus makes things more specific, and he quotes material from Isaiah, material that John would have known by heart. In Isaiah, the material begins with, "Say to those who are fearful of heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come and save you." Then the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the lame will walk, and so on. This was a prophecy in Isaiah that when you see these things happening, it means your God is here. Jesus gives the answer that John needed. The signs that God is with us are being seen. So God is with us. I am the one. At this point, Jesus could have taken a shot at John. He could have said, the things in Isaiah are happening, so I'm the one who is expected. Blessed is the one who realizes this without having to ask me. But he doesn't take the shot. Instead, Jesus tells the disciples of John to relay this message. He says, in my paraphrase of this verse, verse 6, "My signs prove who I am. And blessed is the one who comes to realize who I am and is not offended that the Messiah is different than they expected or different than they wanted." So pass this message on to John. Blessed is John when he is not offended that he realizes God is here, but God is different than he thought God was. And John's disciples head off to carry Jesus' words back to a languishing John. What we find picked up in the shack, what we find with John the Baptist languishing and struggling in prison, as well as what we find with many other followers of Jesus, is that God tends to be way nicer and loving than we anticipated, or often way more loving and nicer than we even want. Crushing humans doesn't appear to be on Jesus' agenda, but lifting them up is. Condemning humans isn't found in Jesus' message, but forgiving the worst of sinners is. And we're faced even today with the dilemma of John the Baptist in Scripture and Mac in the shack. What if God is way nicer than we think? What if God actually lives out his own words, to love our enemies? Can we accept a Jesus who does not actually carry a sword, except for his message of love? We don't hear in this passage whether John actually became offended by the news or not. We don't hear if John was offended that Jesus is essentially saying, I won't be riding at the head of an army with a sword to save you. But the question for us today is, if we discover a way more loving God than we've pictured or than we want, can we accept it without offense?